In this lesson, we'll be talking about the cutoff versus button 2-bet pots, just a bit of an overview of the preflop ranges. So the cutoff opens the pot, and then the button calls, and everyone else remainder folds. There's a few different sizes that the cutoff can open the pot. So the most common size is this 50% raise size, or the 2.25 open size that for 100 big blind deep standard cash. And these seem to run with 5% rate capped at one big blind. But there's also some smaller sizes and a little bit of a bigger size as well. So you can open min in the cutoff, sometimes open a little bit bigger, 2.5 in the cutoff. Most of the time, cutoff is going to be opening to around 50% of the pot, or 2.25, a little over min. Now, after the cutoff opens to 2.25, we have the button's response. And the button's response got a 4% calling range. That's a relatively tight calling range against this cutoff open. All right, and you can see that the hands that the button have called, on average, are going to be stronger than the hands that the cutoff have opened. That's one of the rules of the gap concept. When there's no antes in the pot, the players that continue without any kind of discount or ante will usually continue with a tighter range than the player that opens the pot. All right, let's have a look here in Power Acre Lab, where I've copied the two ranges over. So here in the cutoff, you've got the cutoff range and the button calling range. And we've got a bit of an overview. We can see that the cutoff's range equity is lower than the buttons. In other words, the button on average is going to have a range advantage. But this number doesn't tell us everything, right? We can look at the heat map or the equity graph. So let's have a look at the heat map first, just so we can have a think about what kinds of hands have, in the cutoff against the button call, have a good chunk of equity. And the hands that are over, say, 50% equity against the button calling range actually is not that much of the cutoff's opening range. Pocket sixes up, and then ace jack offsuit, ace 10 suited. Not actually that much. Like, most of the cutoff's opening range is going to be behind the button's calling range. There is going to be some really hands that stand out, which is this aces, kings, and to some degree queens, with a lot of equity against the calling range. Aces, kings, and queens aren't really present in the cutoff's calling range that often, especially queens, maybe a tiny amount, maybe ace king off a tiny amount. But definitely aces and kings never really been called in the button. So there's this enormous equity advantage with those hands there against the button's calling range. But most hands will be at a slight disadvantage, going all the way down to 6-4 and 5-4 suited. Let's have a look at it. Look at it the other way around. So the button's calling range, a little bit hard to see, but this is how the button's calling range against the cutoff open. This is what it looks like. There's good density of pocket pairs, but there's no hands that really smash in terms of equity, right? There's none of these hands have more than 70%. Jacks is only 68.9%. Everything else is between, say, 60% and 40% most of the time, right? So we look at the number of hands that have more than 50% equity here, right? There's actually a fair few more hands that have 50% or more equity in the button's calling range against the cutoff's opening range. It goes all the way down to like king queen offsuit, king 10 suited, ace 7 suited, pocket fives, right? In contrast, when it was the other way around, it was ace jack and ace 10 suited and like pocket sixes. So yeah, the cutoff's opening range is wider than the button's calling range. And just in terms of raw equity, which is a quick back of the envelope calculation, you can see that the button calling range is stronger and is going to hit flops a little bit better. The types of flops that'll hit better are going to be these low flops with a high density of these pocket pairs. These pocket pairs, say 8 through 2s, and 2 through 8s, you've got pretty high density of these pocket pairs in the calling range, and so you can hit sets with them pretty well as the button. And so if the board comes relatively low, it's going to have pretty good nut advantage for the button just because of the high density of the sets in the range. We'll have a look at that again in the equity graph. Let's calculate this. This shows the same thing just in terms of a little graph here. So blue is cutoff and then the green is button. So blue in the cutoff, once again, aces, kings, queens, jacks, and tens. Good chunk of equity against the cutoff calling range, right? Because remember, the cutoff's calling range is those weaker pocket pairs and some strong sort of Broadway hands and sort of Broadway type hands, which can outdraw these big pairs, but are usually fairly far behind pre-flop. But on the other hand, like the cutoff has a lot of these relatively weak hands which open, the weakest of which in terms of equity is 4-5 suited, 4-6 suited, right? You know, these suited gaps, suited connectors, king 5 suited, 7-10 suited, really quite junky hands that open will be behind by a fair amount. So what does this mean? So you've got here the cutoff has strong hands at the top and then a lot more weak hands at the bottom, right? But the button has a lot of hands towards the middle, relatively even compared to the cutoffs, which has a lot of strong hands and then, sorry, a handful of strong hands and then a lot of weak hands, and then the button has some middling hands. So what this means is that the cutoff has a range disadvantage. Okay, we discussed that overall the cutoff has a range equity of 47% versus the 47 point something percent versus the button's 52%. But the cutoff has a polarity advantage, at least pre-flop, right? So there's polarity advantage, which means that a lot of the time the cutoff will have those big pocket pairs. And those big pocket pairs can be used to defend a weak checking range by going for a check raise. And we'll see that when we look at the sims a bit later. That a lot of the time, the cutoff will either make some sort of bet with this polarity in terms of the big pocket pairs for value, and then some weak hands to bluff, or the cutoff will check and then go for a check raise. Depends on the board itself, depends on how well the button hits that kind of board. That'll give some more information about the checking frequency of the cutoff. But usually, because of the range disadvantage and the positional disadvantage as well, the cutoff is going to check to the button. All right, cutoffs open the pot, the button's called, and then most of the time on a lot of different boards, the cutoff will check at quite a high frequency. We could just plug in some random boards just to see what kinds of equities that we get out, right? King 3-2. Okay, that's even worse for the cutoff, right? This might not be what you would expect because the cutoff's got ace king. And then what we can do is we can just look at the heat map again and see how this heat map has changed for both players, right? The 3 and the 2 in terms of the sets of 3, sets of 2s versus at the top here, so sets of 3, sets of 2s, or the cutoff in the green and the button in the green and the cutoff in the blue, versus the kind of ace king part of the range in the cutoff, which the button doesn't have. So once again, you can see that there's a lot of hands like kind of in the middle for the green curve, which is the button, versus the blue, which kind of drops off a lot. So this is saying that the cutoff's range is more polar than the button's range. All right, despite the fact that there's a range disadvantage. Okay, so polarity advantage, range disadvantage. Usually that means it's going to be a fair amount of checking and then small betting into that polar range to deny equity from those weak hands at the bottom. Maybe we can check another board. Okay, this is random. 3, 5, 7. This is pretty obviously going to favor the button, right? Favors it by quite a lot just because of the amount of sets and one pairs with the suited connectors that have hit this board. And the cutoff's got a lot of air at the top, especially the offsuit air on this kind of board. Let's have a look at the heat map. I'll show it more. It'll show up a bit easier. So this heat map in terms of this air here, 10-9, Jack 10 offsuit, Queen Jack off, really just quite trash on this particular board for the cutoff. But look at the heat map for the button, nowhere near as many of those types of hands. Quite heavy in the pocket pairs, lots of decent pairs, and a reasonably high density of sets. There's also the pocket sixes and pocket fours, which draw to a shot straight. The heat map again. Sorry, not the heat map, the equity graph again. Yeah, quite a stark difference compared to the last graph we looked at. Green is button, blue is cutoff. Cutoff's curves all the way underneath, button's all the way on the top. You can see button's got these sets, just big sets, and there's also, what is it? Pocket threes, yeah, pocket sevens, pocket fives, pocket threes. What is this hand? Yeah, pocket sevens for your opponent. Anyway, pocket sevens, pocket fives, pocket threes at the top. Loads of value there, right? That represents almost 10-ish%. Yeah, there's your top 8% roughly of the range. And then after that, just on average, the button's going to have a stronger hand, right? Which is represented by the green curve always being on top of the blue curve for the rest of the range. So for this particular board, the button has a range advantage and a polarity advantage, and so the cutoff is probably going to check and then overfold against a bet. Other kinds of boards, yeah, 225. And we're going to look at a lot of these in later videos. Right, this is just the first video out of a handful on the cutoff versus button single row spot. Even more for the button, remember, because the button's got a lot of pocket pairs in their range, versus the cutoff, which just has a lot of high cards. Heat map again. Right, all these high cards are just really drawing quite thin. Okay, and the pocket pairs are doing well, but the high cards aren't. On the other hand, because there's fewer high card type hands in the button's range, and even the high card hands which the button has, those hands are like ace high and a strong ace high at that, so they'll win at showdown a good chunk of the time on a paired board against weaker ace highs and some king highs. It just has less air, and because it's got less air and it's got high density of a set of fives, a set of twos, and high density of pocket pairs, you can predict that the cutoff is going to check to the button at a very high frequency on this kind of board. Look at the equity graph again. See what that looks like on this board. Very similar to the last one. Maybe a little bit of polarity in terms of the pocket pairs, the big pocket pairs for the cutoff up here, but mostly cutoff is going to check to the button. Ace 10-7, right? Anyone want to hazard a guess as to who's going to have the advantage on this board? Much closer now. Why is it much closer? Probably because the cutoff's got ace 10 offsuit, but the button doesn't. So that's going to be one of the main differences. The set of aces is also there. The set of 10s and the set of 7s is there for both players. So that's not a huge deal. But also the cutoff's going to have a lot of gut shots between the ace and the 10, and a fair few gut shots with the 7 and the 10 as well. Looking at the heat map. Less air, right? These low pocket pairs aren't doing so well, but there's less air. Like this block of hands here, the king queen, king jack, queen jack. There's also 9-8, 9-6, 8-6, jack 9, jack 8. All those hands are gut shots or straight draws of some kind. And there's much less air, and because there's an ace on the board and the cutoff range is reasonably dense in ace X hands, the cutoff has hit this board reasonably well. Looking at the button. Now there's a slight difference between the button and the cutoff. Remember that the button's called, and on average the hands that call are going to be stronger, right? So the ace X that calls, so these ace hands, are actually stronger than the cutoffs, right? So all the cutoff might have quite a lot of ace X in their range, but the ace X that the button has is stronger in terms of it has a stronger kicker. On ace 10, it might not necessarily be the case because of the presence of the 2 pair with the ace 10 offsuit in the cutoff's range. We can go and edit this, changing it slightly from a 10 to a jack. See if that changes things a little bit. It does change things a tad, but now I think because there's going to be a little bit less advantage in terms of the ace 10 and more advantage on the button in terms of the ace jack. Because of the equity advantage, I'd imagine there's going to be some small betting. Remember, because the cutoff has a lot of weak ace x, that weak ace x doesn't really want to run into the stronger ace x from the button. Usually going to be betting small to try and get value from those weaker pocket pairs, and trying to avoid getting hit with a raise by a set. How much time we got? Yeah, I can do one more. Ace 6-4. Alright, so what are we thinking? We're going to be fairly close, no? Yeah, better for the button. Why is it better for the button? Oh yeah, on the previous one, like a lot of that Broadway stuff hit the 10, which is a fair amount of equity. Here, when it goes A6-4, not a lot of the cutoffs range hits the 6 compared to the 10 or the jack, right? The cutoff's got a lot of Broadway, so whenever there's two Broadway cards, the cutoff's going to be doing alright. But only just an ace here, and then there's nothing else. The button's going to have stronger ace x. The button's going to have the set of 6s, the set of 4s at pretty high frequency. And then the cutoff is going to really be struggling with their own ace x, which is going to be fairly weak. Sure, they've got some 2 pairs in terms of ace 6 and ace 4, but don't have the offsuit versions of that. Yeah, alright, we can look at the heat map. So yeah, a lot of these pocket pairs not doing so well. And a lot of air. So king queen all the way down to 8-7. I mean, 8-7 the gut shot. It's like 9-7, which is loads of junky hands, which you just totally missed, right? Compared to the previous one on ace 10-7, right? On a 10, or it was ace jack 7, I think we looked at both of them. The jack hits, you make a pair. The 10 hits, you make a pair, right? You're making middle pair here. But when a 6 hits, like, you're not really making too many pairs because it's just suited hands compared to the offsuit hands when there's Broadway. So when that happens, you've got to be playing more cautiously in the cutoff, just because you don't have that much middle pair. And yeah, bottom pair even less. On the other hand, look at the heat map for the button. Button doesn't have as much air, right? The small amount of air at the bottom can be used as a flop bluff or a check back turn, check back flop and then bet the turn, or some kind of bluff somewhere. But otherwise, like, these pocket pairs will be doing pretty well against the air hands in the cutoffs range. And these ace x hands that have flatted preflop are just stronger than the ace x that the cutoff has on average. Ace queen is just going to beat your opponent's ace 9 offsuit. Ace queen here is now outdrawn pocket kings. Yeah, that's that. Looking at the heat map, sorry, the equity graph again. Yeah, in comparison to the previous board, did we look at the heat map for the? Maybe not. Anyway, equity curves for that one. What was I saying with this? Yeah, so we've got these strong hands, which is the ace x, right? Sorry, the set's at the top, and then there's ace x here. Like, the ace x is just stronger for the button in the green, right? So the ace x is just quite strong, and the cutoff has a lot of air in their range down the bottom here, right? Loads of air. You can think, like, how much air do they have? You can see it, eyeball it here. That's pocket 3s. This is king queen, right? Looking at the blue, king queen. That's almost the 55th percentile, 56.72 percentile. So what does that mean? There's 44% unpaired hands, and on a6-4, which is this flop that we're looking at, on a6-4, it's going to be difficult for those unpaired hands to catch up to an ace, and maybe it'll be able to outdraw a pair. It's going to be difficult for them to outdraw an ace, and so the cutoff a lot of the time is just going to check. The button's going to probably bet small. This junk at the bottom from the cutoff's range is going to have to be forced to fold, let it go. Maybe you can float some, like, suited double backdoor type stuff, like king queen suited with the backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw. Button bet small, cutoff overfolds, goes for the check raise with the ace king or the sets, and has difficulty defending, like those big pocket pairs that we talked about earlier. All right, I probably rambled a bit too long, but as you can see, between the two ranges, on average, the button's going to have some sort of advantage. In some situations, the cutoff can still bet, but most of the time, the cutoff will be checking to the button. The button will often bet small, deny equity from a lot of the junky hands in the cutoff's range, and then the cutoff goes for a little check raise, remembering that the cutoff has those big pocket pairs pre-flop, which big pocket pair pre-flop will still usually make a big pair on the flop. Okay, so that's the end of this overview. See you on the next one.